Afternoon, my name is Megan Castillo and I'm Town Hall's program manager. I have brown hair, brown skin. I'm sitting in front of a white wall with a green plant behind me, and I'm wearing a black vest. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle and our presenting partner, Epiphanies of Equity, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Disability Employment Awareness panel. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are so glad to have you join us virtually. Today's broadcast has closed captioning built in, so you will see that throughout the program, along with our ASL interpreters on screen. The presentation will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To submit your questions for the Q&A portion of the event, please enter meet.ps/disability employment, or scan the QR code right now on your screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat and remind folks where to go when we get to Q&A. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your question concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation and True Brown Foundation. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members tuning in. Epiphanies of Equity provides social equity consulting and advocacy with a focus on the work of disability justice, anti-racism, and systems-level reconstruction for equity and justice. Founder Christiana Obi Sumner is a social equity consultant, educator, and advocate with over a decade of multifaceted experience. Please join me in welcoming Christiana Obi Sumner, who will introduce today's panel.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's always a pleasure to work with Town Hall Seattle, and thank you for folks who are joining us today. I first want to give a huge shout out to the team at Epiphanies of Equity. It is not just me, there are 7 of us. Some folks knew Epiphanies of Equity starting with just me, and we expanded. So I wanted to give a shout out to the team who has been working hard over these last couple months to produce and put this show together. In addition to that, I also want to introduce Callisto, who will be co-facilitating with me today and is also a consulting assistant at Epiphanies of Equity. Today we have 4 panelists that will be talking with us about what it means to dream of disability justice in the workplace. What we mean by that is when we think about accommodations or accessibility, which are all big buzzwords right now in the workplace, we traditionally think of disability rights or following the tenets of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, which was a civil rights policy that was put in place in 1990 and re-ratified in 2004. Unfortunately, most civil rights-based frameworks do not reach the level of equity, justice, and liberation, especially at those intersections. The panelists that we curated and we brought on today are folks who hold those intersections, and I would love to introduce you to some of them right now. The first person is Ricky Kraft. She, her, they are a 29-year-old Black woman who currently works in permanent supportive housing in the Seattle area. She is a fierce advocate of many social issues, both that she herself experiences and for those that affect anyone who lives with marginalizations. Some of the key issues she advocates for are disability justice, as she lives with disabilities herself, including a bipolar diagnosis she has lived with since she was 12, racial justice, LGBTQIA2+ rights, issues surrounding living in a fat body, homelessness, affordable housing, and womanism. Whew. She also works directly with an organization, Vox Noir, which is ensuring that Black mothers are fed, housed, and clothed, especially during this pandemic. When she's not working or advocating, she enjoys playing video games, being an aunt, and sharing memes that will make her friends laugh. Now, what happens for our next panelist when you mix a data nerd and someone passionate about social justice and reaching diverse communities? Sean Glaze, that's who is a research co-lead for the Black Brilliance Research Project. With over 10 years of research experience, Sean has a proven track record of helping people move resources into Black and Brown communities. Her team has developed a grants playbook that has gotten over $10 million plus in under a year for Black and Brown folks, including many small organizations that are led by people with disabilities. Linda Chastain, our third panelist, is a Black queer femme living, working, and building community in Seattle, Washington. Graduating from Clark Atlanta University's Whitney M. Young Jr. School of Social Work in 2015, Linda has been dedicated to health equity for marginalized communities since her introduction to the field. Linda's health equity journey has taken her from working at Planned Parenthood Southeast, the community outreach liaison with the Hepatitis Education Project, to now working as the HIV program coordinator with ARTH, African Americans Reach and Teach Health. Linda is also a project manager and creative director for Queer the Land's Equitable Housing Project. Linda's greatest joy is to create and facilitate spaces for people to show up as their full selves and to work with larger systems to create pathways for equity and accessibility. And our fourth panelist is Yisrael Zahir, who is a queer, trans, mixed race, and disabled person living in the California Bay Area. Growing up transracially adopted in a small town in New England, they found dance and music grounding and healing ways to connect their body and heart that looked very different to those around them. And after being the first person that historically came out as transgender, they started their work in LGBTQIA nonprofits while still in high school. This included creating a GSA in 2007 that still exists today. They continue this in California, and whether it was running support groups and community spaces for queer and trans youth, doing case management and advocacy, or training professionals on racial justice, disability and accessibility justice, and those intersections with queerness, they've always held strong to the power of community connections, potential to wide-scale liberation. 12 years later, and multiple stints of being bedbound, Yisrael is forging a non-traditional path of finding meaningful, heart-led work that is both sustainable for their body and honors the work they've done in their years of mainstream employment. They live with their partner and two goofy and petty pups, and due to currently using a feeding tube, really enjoy sharing the results of being the unofficial resident baker of their apartment complex. Thank you to our four panelists for being here. Such an amazing wealth of experience to talk about some of these things. So the way this is going to go is I'm going to start us off in our panel. Callisto and I will go back and forth, and then we will have a quick 5-minute intermission between 2:35 and 2:40 Pacific time. And then we will come back and look forward to questions from you, the audience, that we can answer. Panelists, are you ready to start?
Yes.
Awesome, I'm seeing some head nods. So the first question to get us started today, it's Disability Employment Month, 2021. And this year comes after 18 months plus of a social equity uprising. So many of us have been fighting for authentic and transformative change. What are the top 1 to 3 shifts employers and organizations should make towards disability justice? And we could do a popcorn style if you just like raise your hand and then talk about it. Or Ricky.
I think the number one shift that employers could do is talk to the people that are employed with them who are living with these disabilities. I think it's very easy to try to have a sweeping idea of what disability justice looks like, but disability justice looks different for those of us who might be working in an office versus those of us who might be working in retail. And also, I think employers realizing that, you know, all disabilities aren't visible. And so being able to ask those who are living with these disabilities, what do you need and what does justice look like for you?
Yeah. Panelists jump in. Back.
Well, something that when talking about this kind of area of what is needed in that way is I think a lot about commitments. I think for a lot of reasons, we live in a really ableist society. It's kind of pretty much ingrained into us, generally so, from a very young age. And so I can recognize that there's a process to unlearning something that is given to the majority of people, at least in this so-called country. And one thing that I've felt over and over is that if you commit to including and recognizing and all the magic that comes from the perspective of being disabled, then the process to figuring out how that works for your organization is so much smoother, because you can start from place of, for the folks who you're working with who are disabled, or for folks who are not currently working there who really would love to have that kind of job, the commitment is the first step, or first way to go. And from there, if you're open-minded and can just like figuring out what works for this particular situation. But the commitment is kind of like the biggest baseline for me, at least.
Yeah, I was just going to say to put people first, to care for your employees first over productivity, over the goals and the benchmarks, and if often when that's mentioned, it's like we have commitments and we have clients and we have grants and funders, but as an ally or an accomplice or whatever word you want to use, or just an employer who cares about their employees, it's your responsibility to stand as a bridge between your employees and your funders and your clients, and let them know that number one is about making sure that your employees are feeling healthy, they're feeling safe, they're feeling supported, and they're being able to receive the assistance or just the care that they deserve. And so all of those other things will fall in line, but the people should come first.
Awesome. Hi, y'all. This is Sean Blaze. I am Black with dark brown skin, and I am talking primarily from the employer perspective. So I have a small business. Before I had employees, I spent years learning about disability justice, about what I could do to create better communities that are actually not just inclusive, but celebratory of people's differences, and really holding people in the ways they want to be held. And so I think that if we just talk about employers or organizations in terms of the people who are already there, we're already too late. If you are trying to create a space that really centers disability justice, and you wait till you have actual people in your organization who you think will represent and carry that work forward, you are doing it wrong. And so even though there's not a clear handbook, guideline, recipe, series of steps to take to make sure that you are truly operating in a disability justice framework fully to fidelity, it's still important to do your homework, to look at what people have already put together, especially disabled people of color, and when you're designing out your plan for an organization. And I think that a lot of times when I hear people talk nowadays, because of the uprisings, people think that you can sort of quickly, checklist your way there. And in my experience, that's not the case. And with that, I'll pass it back to the group.
It was already a great discussion already, and I agree with so much of that, of what y'all said. And there's so much of this that I'm excited to hear what more you have to say. I'm going to pass the next question off to Callisto.
Yeah, so much that you all shared with those questions. I have never been so emotional on a panel, but this is such an important topic. And with that, I lead with this second question. Hostile accommodations is a term that Christiana has used to describe when workplaces create near impossible or inaccessible barriers to accommodations. We are seeing an increased number of organizations across the board and across the country that are denying accommodations to disabled workers in order to, quote, return to normal, end quote. Have you experienced or witnessed hostile accommodations in the workplace yourself? And secondly, what were the impacts of being in that situation? I see Ricky or Yisrael.
Go for it, Ricky.
Okay. So yes, I have experienced hostile accommodations. As we've talked about, I live with what's some call an invisible disability, which I don't always necessarily agree with, because in the worst parts of my bipolar, it is very obvious that I am going through something. But I have for the last few years been very stable on medication. And so I can quote unquote mask. But I have found when I go to an organization and I say, hey, these are the accommodations I need, even if it's something as simple as, you know what, I can come to work 4 days, but 5 days is too much. I can't do 5 days in a row, but I can do 4, and I can make those 4 days count. And some of the barriers that I see, I am fortunate enough that I have a really good relationship with all of my providers, and my providers work as a team. But I know many people who are on, months, even years long wait list to see a psychiatrist, and these accommodations require that they be signed off on by a licensed professional, which sometimes feels like if you're not providing health insurance for your employees, then why are you asking them to get a doctor to sign off on this? And I've seen the paperwork, and it is confusing, and they don't realize that some doctors even charge you to fill out any FMLA paperwork or any accommodation paperwork. And I think that when you are in a space, I think especially for the new ones, the people who are, just now recognizing that they have a right to these accommodations due to their disability, especially if it's one that, may not be seen. It's very frightening. It's very scary to ask for these things. And also, these accommodations have to go through the HR department, which feels very punitive. Like no one really wants to talk to HR more than they have to, but having to go through this accommodation, and coming from the nonprofit sector, one of the hardest parts about these hostile accommodations too is HR departments and nonprofits are tiny. There's 3 people, maybe 3 to 5 people working in this department, and now they all know your information. And I personally have been victim to an HR department that knew about my disability and did things like gaslight me and things like that. And I think that also makes it very scary going into new employment to want to ask for accommodations. And so that impact is not just in the time that it's happening at that workplace, but going on in the future. And I just worry about those people who are not as able to advocate for themselves.
I can speak if no one wants to speak at this moment, but I have had in 2019, I actually woke up one day and the left side of my body stopped working. And since I work at a small nonprofit, you know, and luckily this person no longer works there, and I've always had an advocate at my workplace, but this person knew step by step the things that were happening to me. And I had also been diagnosed with lupus like less than 9 months earlier. So they knew every single thing that happened. They saw me, they saw that I couldn't button my shirt, and still asked illegally if I could get the doctor to write out exactly my diagnoses and exactly what was going on with my body. Not just a signed confirmation or, you know, what Ricky was talking about. I literally broke down and cried in the office. I couldn't believe that it was happening to me, mostly because this person had witnessed it. And even in that moment, they wanted me to prove that this was happening to my body in a very confusing time for me. And so that was hostile. And I had, you know, an advocate who was saying, no, this is illegal. They can't do that. And this is what you need to provide. And I'll remove them from, you know, managing you in that aspect. But that person still kept their job and stayed for a while and was still hostile toward me in a personal manner. Going from not even acknowledging me or answering my emails or providing support, and they're my manager. So I've experienced that. I've experienced people telling me that what I'm asking for actually will make my condition worse, as a person who lives with ADHD and depression, all other kinds of things that affect my memory, needing to take notes, and have been told that that's inappropriate and that it actually is going to distract me. And so having to be in that moment, like, should I even continue to ask for the things that I need? And how many times do I have to continue to reiterate that this is what I need, and that also you cannot tell me what I need and what I don't in these different moments. And so I think that just even in the interpersonal things that happen, people just not understanding or thinking that you're making an excuse and you having to prove yourself is incredibly stressful, and it honestly makes your conditions worse because your body and your mental is impacted.
I really appreciate y'all very much. Feels like a gift to kind of a reminder. I mean, it sucks that we've been through so many of these kind of barriers and painful things. And there is also a relief of like that, you know, I'm not just like bananas and making these things up, or, you know, from a first question from a like really young age, I realized that like if I wanted to be able to exist in a space, I have to create that. You know, a lot of people like, you know, are able to go to school and feel like they're able to learn in a way where they can capture their learning and they can understand new things and they can stay present. And there are people who can go to a job and just like the only thing they have to worry about is like, you know, forgetting their keys at home or things like that. Like, you know, when I was working or in school, I was always like, these baseline things don't have room for me, so I just have to make it. And so that's why I ended up working at a very young age in nonprofits and queer work, because there wasn't an existence in which those things were around me and I needed them to survive. So I had to create my own survival. And the last job that I was at, I've actually not worked officially since November of 2017, because I was forced out of that position and my health became also very bad with that. But when I was interviewing, after I got the job, I learned two things directly from my supervisor. One, which she said was that when I came into my interview and I was using forearm crutches, as mobility devices, she told the coworkers that that I shouldn't get hired because I'm disabled, and it would be a liability for her, and she just didn't think I would be good enough to do it. And I didn't know that. And I came back to do a job shadow, and the job shadow she particularly tried to test me in was that you have a meal night, so we'd have to for use, so we have to like set up tables and food and things like that. And I kind of realized what was happening, and so I kind of made my body be able to do things like lift a table in that moment. And that's what she was like, okay, I saw that you can actually be functional, so I guess, you know, you can have a job. And just like, you know, again and again in that position, just trying so hard to be recognized that like I am really good at this and I really care about the people that I work with. Some of these people that I'd worked with for 10 years. And when I had to leave, just based on all this kind of like built up things, it was and still is really painful. And it really has given me a lot of pause to figure out like, is more mainstream jobs even viable, not just for my body, but for my own just like mental well-being. It's been too much. And you know, when I see other people at jobs and kind of see what's happening, you know, with the pandemic and everything, there's going to be a really big influx of people who are going back to work, but also have a really different body for the first time in their lives. You know, the term effects of people who've had, who may have had COVID, like we don't even know the long term of what's going to happen. And so I've been trying to figure out how can I talk more about kind of like a disability doula process for people returning to work or just any other parts of their lives. Because a lot of people, yeah, again, they have really different bodies and they deserve to be honored for all of the work they've been doing their entire lives, whether or not it relates to the job or, you know, with their family. So that just feels like a really present part of it that kind of my experience in those jobs kind of really has influenced how I've been trying to understand that.
This is so great. I think Callisto and I are talking about how we continue to have y'all talk about these amazing pieces and then shorten Q&A. But let's go to the third question. As we're talking about these hostile accommodations, because this is a great conversation, really, I want to say to the audience that please share with us if any of these stories resonate with you. This is something that the hostile accommodations piece is something that I've witnessed both in my experience and through consulting. And so if you're interested in learning more about the hypothesis of what this means, you can Google it because it's a new term, hostile accommodations, and there will be a South Seattle Emerald article that comes up that's called Opinion: the Violence of Hostile Accommodations. Let us know if you also see this in your life. Going to the third question, and then I think we're going to, I think this is what we're going to do. We're going to shorten the Q&A to 10 minutes, which means we're going to go to 2:40 and then have a 5-minute break and then go to a 10-minute Q&A. So we have more time to get through at least this and another question because this is amazing. So while disability justice is the dream, it feels like we are still fighting for basic disability rights as written in the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. One of the main barriers seems to be employers forgetting folks with madness or psychological disabilities, invisible disabilities, chronic disabilities, and intellectual developmental disabilities, as well as, of course, others that may have been missed in their ADA plan. What are some foundational shifts workplaces should make to be inclusive of often excluded communities based on the ADA?
Well, I was going to say, oh, I'm sorry, Ricky, go ahead.
You can go first. I'll go next.
You know, I I didn't think about it, probably because my own internalized ableism. But when Israel mentioned a doula for entering the workplace of just 2018 and 2019 for me was a time of great instability for my body, and 2020 and COVID was my doula. Having to get up and go to events when I couldn't even use part of my body, but I couldn't also take off. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're staying home. I was like, this is amazing. This is perfect. And how long will this last? And it lasted for a very long time. And actually, I mean, for me, I'm very fortunate to be in a place where I feel like I can advocate for myself and saying like, yeah, we don't have to go back. We can, our jobs actually don't call for us to be, in the office all the time and working 9 to 5 or 9 to 8, that I can be able to work on a schedule that feels good for me and my body, and still get the work done and not be stressed out, and not put myself at risk. So I think having a doula would be perfect. I would love to hear Israel's idea around that more, but having the ability to be able to not have to feel like you're navigating the space by yourself. I know that we mentioned HR, and anyone who knows, especially a person of color and a disabled person, knows HR is not your friend. And so in many places, and so if your organization has HR at all, but there should be advocacy. There should be an advocate in the workplace for you, and not just based on the personal relationships that you have, but someone who is designated, honestly, by the state. This goes beyond the employer, but it should be provided as a public service and good for a person to be able to help you navigate those spaces physically if you're not able to. Or, you should be able to have computer technology. I couldn't use my hands, so I had to speak into the computer for months. And so that shouldn't be an extra burden that an employee takes on themselves. It should be, put within the budget that's used, whether it's utilized or not. It should be there always. And, any other accommodation that a person needs should be in the budget that might cost money for the organization. It could be contingent. So yeah, that's some of my ideas.
All right, I'll go next. I think the number one foundational shift that employers can do is just actually listening to the people who are asking for accommodations. Like, just check your own ableism when someone is, especially someone with an invisible disability. I remember, because I've talked about masking and being stable on medication, but I remember the first time when my body was just like, you know what, hey, 40 hours a week in 5 days is not it. And asking for that accommodation and being told point blank, well, you seem fine. And I'm like, yes, but if I continue to do like this, I'm going to have a manic episode and I'm not going to come to work at all. And so there's this like two-sided thing with accommodations where one, they are hostile and the process to getting one is just brutal. And the other side where they almost want to infantilize the person who's asking for the accommodation as if I haven't lived with this disorder or this diagnosis or whatever for the entirety of my life. And I think even more so, when we talk about long COVID and we talk about other things, that not every person who has a disability, especially, psychological or invisible, has had that disability their entire life. There are many people, we're going to see an influx of people who have never been disabled before in their life coming into the workforce. And employers need to be prepared to deal with that and realizing that everyone's accommodation looks different. The way I need accommodations for my bipolar disorder does not look the same as someone else's accommodation for that. And I think in that, and we talk about intersectionality, we need to also take into account I can tell you that as a fat Black woman asking for accommodation, it looks completely different and the process is completely different than if I was not in a fat Black body asking for an accommodation. And so I think we need to put the work and the labor on the people who are creating these policies in these HR departments. And like Linda said, I think that there needs to be some kind of government oversight, because the stories I hear, I'm like, if we had the ability, we could sue so many of these employers, out of, they wouldn't exist anymore. But there's this kind of subtle thing where these employers know this person probably doesn't have the bandwidth to come after us. And if we just keep stalling and making it harder, they'll eventually give up. And so I think the emphasis and the foundational shift needs to be, employers need to just be ready to accommodate the people that they hire, because they may have a disability coming in, or they may develop a disability while they work for you, and it shouldn't be hard. And you should also just believe people when they say, hey, I would be a better employee if I could do this, if you provided me with this. And it's wild because so many accommodations are something that you probably don't even need paperwork for. It's literally something that, like a schedule change, I shouldn't need a doctor's note for a schedule change. If I'm telling you that this schedule works better for me and I can still get all my work done. But I think the overhaul needs to be organizations taking a deep look and realizing how ableist even their disability policies are.
I see. Yisrael, then Sean.
So when I was thinking about this question, I think the thing that just keeps coming again and again is like, oh, what is function? Like, what is good enough? What is work? What are these things? And I've been really obsessed with like the idea of translating and finding the spirit of things, and and kind of seeing what happens when you broaden things out. So for example, like, when I was doing work at a youth program, and because I was using like a wheelchair or crutches and these different things, the building, my job itself, it was doing renovations. And so by traversing through the building in the way that I do, like they added accessibility features to the building of the like San Francisco LGBT Center in San Francisco that has made it more accessible, only because I was there to kind of, have that challenge. But also when it comes to kind of what a few folks were saying, is like, if you have someone coming in who like might need to use voice to text feature, like you can see a new way of like processing information, putting out information. I think the point just being that like when we open the door, the area, whatever, to everyone, there are new things there that would never have otherwise been discovered. There's so much magic and creativity and expansiveness that comes as a side to being disabled, to being people of color, to being queer and trans. It is an entirely different world than like a lot of employers have ever seen. And so that just adds more of that to the world and makes everyone's lives as a whole so much better because of that. And last little tiny bit I also want to say is like, when we're thinking about these overlooked kind of things, I also want to talk about the intersections of grief in that. And part of why, when I left my job in 2017, I was on disability for like temporary disability. And the diagnosis that was put on there was actually around grief, because my father and multiple friends had passed away in that time as well. And until then, I didn't really understand of like, oh, there's this like medical understanding that grief takes a lot out of you. And it's something that you need to heal from, and from a different kind of scale. And so not only just thinking about how the COVID interactions with this, but also like it's a lot of, the weight of ableism, the grief of loss that happens to a lot of disabled people, like that's legit. And that's it's hard and it's real. And that's something that really needs to be seen. And I think it intersects with kind of like every kind of way of living. Like, you know, as I lose more of my eyesight, like I can have these other, I can go to work in a different way, but also just like recognizing that there is grief and you're allowed to feel that and see its impacts and try and take care of yourself and each other.
Yes, thank you. And then Sean, bring us home.
Yes. As I reflect on the question you had asked about, like really thinking about those foundational shifts and how it relates to the ADA specifically, I think about two main things. One, when it comes to the ADA component, I think a lot of people just aren't familiar with the ADA when they're thinking about becoming an employer, when they're thinking about starting an organization. And I think that if you use ADA as like your only sort of guiding star, you're already like missing the boat. Like, I'm sorry, it is so bare minimum basic that if you can't, like that, I don't want people to aspire towards like ADA compliance. Is one thing I'll say. I do think that because the question was focused on that, something that people may not realize is, and I think some of the panelists are speaking to this a little bit about the awareness of the employer about like a disability and accommodation being needed. It's while it is true that an employer doesn't have to provide an accommodation if they don't know that someone has a disability. And so there's like this idea of like disclosure being like the most important like thing that triggers ADA in some way. There's still other ways to where the employer doesn't necessarily have to, like the employer doesn't necessarily have to know, but they can still like tell or be seen as knowing. The example that the government usually gives is if you see someone that uses a wheelchair, and even if the person doesn't say that they have a disability, you're supposed to basically know of the disability, and therefore you're bound and are accountable to following through. And I think that really when we think about like foundational shifts, we think about how we shouldn't be aspiring for like the absolute bare minimum. We should be thinking about workplaces, I think, in terms of like, how do I create a maximally liberatory workplace environment? How do I really center that idea of like liberation and joy in like the workplace and the community org or whatever I'm creating? Because when you do that, you start to do things like, we're going to have a no questions asked time off policy. And yeah, that'll benefit people with disabilities. That'll benefit fucking everybody. Sorry to be allowed to swear. That'll benefit everybody. And like, what are some of the other things? Well, we're going to, you know, really focus on this idea that we're not going to center productivity above everything. We're going to center like people actually taking care of themselves, whatever that means. We're going to center this idea that you don't owe people an explanation for like why you're having an off day or some type of needing to tell in order to create an accommodation. We're going to center this idea that you don't have to always be able to articulate clearly and persuasively and advocate for yourself in order to get your needs met. We're going to create a workplace where it's like, we're just going to be all operating under this idea that we're all looking out and caring for each other. And if someone notices, wow, that person looks a little bit more tired or rough around the edges, then the rest of us are all thinking, well, how can we help and support, take things off of this person's plate? It doesn't matter like if our policy is ADA compliant or not, right? Like when we shift our focus to thinking about creating liberation and joy in our relationships with each other, then we're no longer trying to figure out if we're meeting some narrow, like bare bone requirement.
That's like mic drop right before this break too. Like that was perfect. So this is what we're gonna do. So it's 2:44. I got 3 minutes on my piece. This 3 minutes is for us because accessibility, inclusivity, disabled folks. We're gonna take a 3-minute break in case we need to think, we need to go to the bathroom. I'm going to hit this. You're going to hear me call out when it's a minute down. And then that also gives you, the audience, the choice to put any questions in the Q&A in the chat. We do have 2 additional questions left. So if you don't have anything else that you want to ask, that's cool, because we got more stuff for you when you come back. If you do, you have 3 minutes. So the break starts now. Excited to see you in a second. Hope that helped with some of the process. I know it helped me and helped me finish my coffee, which is exciting. We had one audience question that's here in the chat, and that audience question is, and anyone answer if you have an answer. Do you have tips for getting or having an advocate when trying to request accommodations at work? I'm going to say really quick, if someone came to EOE with that question, my first, second, and third suggestion is always document everything, literally everything, document it all. And document it in a space that you have access to it in the event that you're not able to access technology in your workplace. And also reach out to folks who you trust with your story to be alongside you. If you are unionized, ensure that your union is well-versed in disability justice so that they can properly advocate for you. I will open this up to any of the panelists as well. Oh, Ricky, I see your hand.
So yes, of course, document everything, just assume that something is going to go down. So document everything, also document with people that are outside of your workplace. But this is coming from a fat Black woman. Have someone who has more privilege than you go with you that you trust. Have someone who has more privilege with you, more privilege than you, go with you to advocate. And, you know, I'm going to be frank, as a fat Black woman, I have had my white coworkers, my white male coworkers, my former boss, who would advocate heavy for me, because I knew that if I sent this message that was very rightfully so, while dealing with a hostile accommodation, I knew that if I sent this email to them, they would take it as aggressive because they knew who I was and what I looked like. So have someone who you know can use the extent of their privilege to advocate on your behalf if you need to, especially if it gets contentious or something like that. And it's unfortunate that that's the way that we have to go about it sometimes. But that would be my number one suggestion. And I also think it's also a great way to save bandwidth. If you're not having to fight as hard, you have someone who can fight those battles for you, whether it be someone in the workplace or someone outside of the workplace. But that would be my suggestion.
Real quick, the things that I would definitely go for and definitely do go is that, one, practice beforehand, know what you want to ask or what your needs are. I find that repeating them out loud is really helpful for me to kinesthetically get them in my body. So that way, if I'm anxious during that time, I have this kind of like thing already back up in myself. And I agree, bring someone with you. Don't go alone. You're documenting, whoever is receiving is documenting, your other person is documenting. I at this point only go to doctor's appointments with other people there. And when I did that at work, when I brought someone with me, it made such a huge difference. Accountability is so much more possible when other people are keeping, the accountability gets wider. And I think this especially applies to folks who might have invisible disabilities or things that might not be seen going into it, because there could be a lot of dismissal. So having grounded and sort of like information and what you want can be really helpful for if people start like saying things like, you don't look disabled, or these sort of things that can be really stressful. So that's what I find to be helpful for that.
Yeah, I would also say, like, if it's hard to have an advocate for yourself, you have to often be your own advocate. So I would just say, to, like Christiana said, document everything. If you're asking for an accommodation and someone is either outwardly denying you, or they are trying to kind of scoot around your question, or they simply don't respond, like they ignore you, they ignore your emails, that you reiterate your interpretation of their statement and ask them, are they, denying you in a reasonable accommodation for your chronic illness or disability. I also think another way is trying to bring people in by like educating them, not like educating them on your disease, but saying like, oh, I need this. And studies have shown that this is very helpful for people who are living with this illness or disability. And just say like this, you're not pulling this out from, your behind, which it doesn't really matter anyway. But saying like this is actually helpful. This will improve my productivity, improve my commitment to the work, and making sure that you're just spelling that all out. And I like to do that, if you can, in like a written form instead of verbal. Like if you say it verbal, then you need to after that meeting, go back and write an email about everything that was stated in that meeting, and make sure that they respond or request a response.
So we are at the last 5 minutes. And so this is what I'm going to do. I want to first thank everyone for coming to this panel. I'm super excited for everything that we learned. This was amazing. I also wanted to, again, give thanks to the Epiphanies of Equity team, to Ricky, Sean, Linda, and Yisrael for this. Thank you for Town Hall Seattle for giving us this space. If you have any other questions, or you're an employer like, I need to get myself some of that disability justice, Epiphanies of Equity is here, as well as some of the folks on this call. In our last 5 minutes, I'm going to pass this question on to Callisto to ask and close us out. I want to encourage folks that we have 5 minutes to try to do this in like 60 to 90 seconds, and also take that opportunity to plug where folks can find you if you also offer these services, because we all can eat and this is a community effort.
Okay, here is our final question for the evening. Overall, disability justice is coming up in more conversations as the pandemic sheds a light on systemic ableism. We wanted to center folks at the intersection of disability, race, and queerness in this panel. Even in workplaces that may discuss accessibility and anti-racism, as well as justice for queer, trans, non-binary folks, we have rarely seen all three held intersectionally. It is important to move towards intersectionality in the workplace. As we have seen these past 18 months, liberatory frameworks tend to be misinterpreted or co-opted when it becomes public discourse. So what would you say to folks watching this panel who would want to do more for disability justice, but want to ensure they are truly in solidarity with our communities?
I think the simplest thing is to find someone who does this work who's also living with a disability and a chronic illness. Hire them and pay them well for their work to walk you through from the ground up and then back down around policy procedure, and making sure that you are changing the organizational culture around interpersonal interactions between colleagues who are living with chronic illness. That's really the simplest thing.
I think that, going off of what Linda said, I think it's about making sure that if you are an able-bodied person, that you are not somehow centering yourself in this conversation, because it's not about you. And so not only hiring people who are living this experience, but making sure that you're also talking to the people who perpetuate this harm on this community. Like, take all of that energy and go talk to other able-bodied people and tell them to check their ableism in that way. So hire people who are living these lived experiences, and then take everything that you learn and go, don't gaslight our community, go talk to the community that you're a part of, so that way they stop harming us.
I think everyone's saying is really awesome. In addition, I'd say to hiring folks to do that work, one aspect is if you're an employer, do not expect your employees to do all of the teaching around disability and accessibility ableism. And also, don't force your disabled employees to watch that learning happening in real time. I think I have built up a lot of pain around, like, okay, I'm at a disability justice workshop, and everyone is kind of like very in their beginning stages of it and are saying things that like are pretty harmful. those things need to be learned and kind of gotten out of systems, but don't give the option to not have the people who are most impacted by that harm have to, you know, see it in that way. Be honest about where your organization and yourself is at. You know, understand intersections of, like, especially for trans people, people of color, you know, marginalized, like degrees are very hard to get. Financial things are really hard to get. Job training that is free and accessible so people can actually get jobs. You know, don't just rely on diplomas, all of those sort of things. But just coming at a place of commitment and care. And if anyone wants to explore doing disability doula work, it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I don't have a set up thing with it. But if anyone wants to like kind of journey on that, I'm trying to, you know, pull that to a focus email or such things. Appreciate y'all.
I feel like everyone already gave like the answer to that question. And so I'm going to add on just a little bit more about concretely things people may not normally think about. And one of them is I want employers to really start building disability justice into their budgets. So when you are submitting grant applications, when you're building your business plan, when you are really thinking about the material conditions of the work you do, I want you to be investing at that level. I want you to be thinking about like, okay, if you don't currently offer health insurance, your plan is now to, and you want to have employees, your plan is now to start building in that plan that when you have employees, you'll have great health insurance, not the bare minimum. That when you are figuring out benefits, you'll have long-term and short-term disability. You'll have, you know, the things that people need to thrive built into what you're going to do instead of waiting until you get big enough or have enough profit or something in order to trigger that. I want people to be very intentional about about their business in the same way. For businesses, employers, I'm always talking about employers when I'm thinking about businesses. I want you to be on purpose focused on disability justice, not just in terms of having nice thoughts, but really having concrete actions and having your dollars back up what you're saying out loud.
Thank you all so much. This was amazing. Thank you all for gifting us these extra 2-3 minutes too. I know we went over a little bit. Again, thank you all to all of our panelists. Thank you to Town Hall Seattle. Thank you to the Epiphanies of Equity team for working and getting this produced, especially while I was out. So I like, if y'all are watching, which I know you all, shout out to y'all. Please reach out to any of us here on this panel, to Epiphanies of Equity if you're an organization looking for those concrete solutions towards liberation and equity. And I hope you have a great Saturday. And my call to action to y'all is go back to your mission statements. I know that y'all all wrote equity and anti-racism statements last year. My last question to y'all is, how's that going? Reach out to us if there's anything going on with that. And yeah, thanks for coming.